July 4th, 1863. Many don't know yet, but today is the day the Union won the Civil War. But why this day? Well, in 1863, two major campaigns were happening at the exact same time. In the West, General Ulysses S. Grant was besieging the city of Vicksburg, and in the East, Confederate General Robert E. Lee was invading deep into Union territory. Both campaigns could change the course of the war, but why and how were these two places so pivotal? Let's start with Vicksburg. The city of Vicksburg was an extremely strategic city, as it was located on the most important river in the Confederacy, the Mississippi. This river was the life force of the Confederate cause, allowing the transportation of troops, weapons, food, cotton, and even information. Whoever controlled the river controlled the bridge between the west and east of the Confederate States. Additionally, the Mississippi was a major hub for world trade, a place that the South could gain and sell goods to other nations. The city itself was also a major communication and railroad center, ultimately earning it the nickname the Gibraltar of the Confederacy. For the Union, preventing the flow of civilian goods and military logistics across the Confederacy was a major goal. So in order to do this, they had to capture the cities and forts that controlled the Mississippi. President Abraham Lincoln even stated, "See what a lot of land these fellows hold, of which Vicksburg is the key. The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket. We can take all the northern ports of the Confederacy, and they can defy us from Vicksburg." I am acquainted with that region and know what I am talking about, and as valuable as New Orleans will be to us, Vicksburg will be more so. Confederate President Jefferson Davis had similar thoughts, describing Vicksburg as the nailhead that held the South's two halves together. Early in the war, Union General Winfield Scott devised the Anaconda Plan, which blockaded the Confederacy and called for a massive land and naval attack along the Mississippi River. Although it wasn't entirely implemented, the Navy did begin to rapidly build a fleet of ironclad warships. So when General Ulysses S. Grant became Union commander of the Western forces, he prioritized control of the Mississippi. In December 1862, after securing other forts along the Mississippi, Grant began his first attempt at capturing Vicksburg. But he had a major problem: how to actually get his forces to the city. You see, the thing about Vicksburg is that it is extremely well defended. This city itself sat on a 200-foot bluff on the east bank of the Mississippi, allowing artillery to rain down on any invaders. Thus, any assault from the river would be obliterated. West of the river was a landscape of swamps, bayous, thick forests, and muddy lowlands, making military movements basically impossible. The northeast was not much better, containing a jungle-like forest, which Grant quickly learned of during his first attempt, as his supply line was wrecked by Confederate cavalry operating out of the forest. But despite these setbacks, Grant persisted in his attempts. Finally, he concocted his brilliant, albeit highly risky plan. Since the only place to position troops around Vicksburg was the southeast, he needed to get his troops there. To do this, he ordered Admiral Porter's ironclad ships to cut down past Vicksburg so that his ships could transport Grant's army across the Mississippi, enabling his army to be positioned southeast of Vicksburg. This plan was, of course, extremely risky. First off, he led his army through the thick swamps southwest of Vicksburg. Then he waited for Admiral David Porter, a man whose successes determined the outcome of this campaign. Fortunately, on April 16th, Porter rapidly made his daring descent down the Mississippi. Confederate bonfires lit up all around him as their artillery edged closer and closer to his fleet. Nevertheless, he doesn't falter and successfully makes it down the Mississippi. With his transport ship set, Grant needed his army to cross the Mississippi. So, to stretch the Confederate forces, he instructed Sherman to distract the Confederates in the north, while General Grierson distracted them in the east. The distractions allowed Grant to successfully land, stunning Confederate General John C. Pemberton, who was in charge of the defense of the city. Even though Grant's large 40,000 Union force was near Vicksburg, he still had extreme difficulties. The entire plan relied on him having to operate deep in enemy territory, subsequently cutting off his critical supply lines as his men tried to live off the land. To protect his rear, Grant turned to the Mississippi capital of Jackson. There, General Joseph E. Johnston was assembling a relief force for Pemberton. On May 1st, Grant severed his supply lines to rush deeper into enemy territory, but Johnston actually retreated, allowing Grant to occupy Jackson. This victory not only deprived Pemberton of reinforcements, but it also cut off Vicksburg from their critical supplies they got from Jackson. So, with vulnerability in Vicksburg, Grant marched towards the city. Although Vicksburg was surrounded, the city was still heavily fortified. However, with the blazing summer fast approaching, Grant decided to act, ordering multiple assaults on May 19th and 22nd. Unfortunately for him, these attacks proved costly, with the Confederate network of trenches and artillery preventing any substantial holdings. With little choice, Grant reluctantly settled in for a siege, ordering his roughly 70,000 troops to construct over 15 miles of zigzagging trenches that steadily brought them closer to the Confederate positions. While Grant settled in for a siege in May, let's look at what was happening in the Eastern Theater at the same time. In early May, General Robert E. Lee decisively defeated General Hooker at the Battle of Chancellorsville, but he had a very difficult choice to make, one that could win the South the war or make them lose it. Head west to reinforce Pemberton at Vicksburg to stop the city from falling to the Union, or charge north to the capital of Washington, D.C. to try and pressure a peace deal. With Lee roughly 900 miles away, it was highly unlikely he or any forces he sent west would arrive in time to affect the outcome. And with an invasion, some believed the Union would send troops west, relieving more pressure off of Vicksburg. Additionally, with the Confederate army in the north, the southern farmers would be able to replenish their crops easier, while the invaders lived off the northern soil. Lee also incorrectly read the political situation. He assumed many in the north were on the verge of peace, and that their war effort was failing. Ultimately, all these factors persuaded Lee to invade the North once again, this time much deeper and much more ambitious. Lee began the campaign on June 3rd, first moving his 75,000-strong army away from Fredericksburg and into the Shenandoah Valley. From there, his march would be much more concealed. Then, as they arrived in Northern Territory, they would disperse into multiple smaller forces, where they would gather supplies. Various skirmishes had occurred in the countryside, but Lee just learned of some terrifying information. The newly appointed general, George Meade, and his 90,000-man army was rapidly approaching. Lee immediately ordered all his scattered forces to Cashtown, 8 miles northwest of Gettysburg. General Henry Heath was the first to arrive, in search of supplies, specifically shoes. But at the same time, Meade had sent some of his force to Gettysburg. The ensuing clash just so happened to start the bloodiest battle of the war. In the early morning of July 1st, General Heath engaged General John Buford. The Confederates launched an attack that pushed Buford back, though fortunately for him, he was reinforced by General Reynolds. Though just as quickly as he came, Reynolds was lost, as he was shot in the head. This disaster prevented the Union from adequately holding the line. The battle began to exacerbate as A.P. Hill's corps backed up Heath. With more and more troops arriving, the Confederates were able to continuously push back the Union to Cemetery Hill. By the afternoon, the Union's position began to solidify, looking like a giant fishhook. The Union position is already strong, but the interior lines easily allowed reinforcements to any sector. In the afternoon, General Ewell considered a hill too fortified to assault. So thus ends the first day of the battle, which would determine the fate of the country. In the west, the Confederate situation looked way more bleak. Grant's artillery had been pummeling the city day and night for 6 weeks. Pemberton reported that roughly a third of his force was no longer able to fight. Grant's lines were closing in, tightening the noose around the city, and he was even preparing another assault. Civilians and soldiers inside starved, and many became very ill. The civilians could only bear the carnage by hiding in caves and eating anything they could find. One soldier reportedly stated, "If you can't feed us, you had better surrender us, horrible as the idea is." With few supplies left, General Pemberton saw 2 outcomes, either to evacuate the city and cut my way out, or to capitulate upon the best attainable terms. So on July 1st, he asked his commanders about the condition of the men and if they could possibly fight their way out. The Battle of Gettysburg, July 2nd. The Union has heavily fortified their hills, causing General Longstreet to suggest a retreat toward Washington, D.C., to make the Union fight them on more favorable ground. However, the rest of the generals heavily disagreed, so Lee ordered a reluctant Longstreet to assault the Union left, while General Ewell would attack the right. However, the Union actually struck first. General Sickles defied Meade's defensive plan and instead went on the offensive, moving his troops to the higher ground near the peach orchard. Longstreet's men assaulted the Union positions, engaging in brutal fighting. Many targets, such as the wheat field, Devil's Den, and Little Round Top, changed hands multiple times. Due to miscommunication, which happened often with the Confederates, Ewell didn't begin his right flank assault until evening, so even though he gained some ground, darkness ultimately halted any more advancement. July 2nd, Vicksburg. Pemberton's officers were unanimous in their response to him. Grant's siege had broken them. Any attempt to cut through the Union line and escape would end in catastrophe, and since there was no prospect of being relieved, their situation was truly futile. Pemberton had only one choice: surrender. The Battle of Gettysburg, July 3rd. Despite harsh casualties from the previous day, General Lee believed Union resistance was slowly crumbling. He saw that Meade had to reinforce his flanks, thus weakening his center. This was something Lee planned on exploiting. Even better, Lee had been reinforced by General Jeb Stuart's cavalry and General Pickett's infantry. With these men, Lee ordered a massive spearhead assault into Meade's center. After a massive cannon bombardment that ultimately did nothing, Pickett's charge began at 3 p.m. In the sweltering heat, the Confederates crossed almost a mile of open fields just to get to the Union lines. Thousands of rifles and massive barrages of artillery rained down upon them. About half of the 12,000 men involved in the charge were killed, captured, or wounded, shattering any hopes of a favorable outcome for the South. Lee was devastated, stating, "It's all my fault. It is I who have lost this fight." July 3rd, Vicksburg. At almost the exact same time that Pickett's bloody charge took place, General Grant and General Pemberton met to discuss surrender. Unconditional surrender Grant, as you might have guessed, demanded unconditional surrender, but ultimately Grant allowed the roughly 30,000 Confederates in Vicksburg to be paroled rather than imprisoned. Independence Day, July 4th, 1863. Jubilation for the Union, utter despair for the Confederates. In the early rainy morning of the 4th, Lee withdrew from Gettysburg. In the west, Pemberton, at 10 a.m., officially surrendered his men and the city to General Grant. The men who bravely defended the city for 47 days began to march out, stack their rifles, and fold their flags. The entire campaign since March 29th claimed 10,000 Union casualties to the Confederates' 9,000, plus the 29,000 that surrendered. The consequences. For Gettysburg, the Union had just beaten the Confederates in the most northern battle, the third largest and the bloodiest. Lee's 75,000-man force suffered 28,000 casualties, almost 40%. The Confederacy, unlike the Union, simply could not replenish men as fast or as easily. Their manpower had been severely weakened. Second, the Union got a massive morale boost, decisively defeating Lee after a series of defeats. Never again would the South be able to mount an invasion into the North. For the rest of the war, the South would be on the defensive. The consequences of Vicksburg. Of course, the biggest consequence was that the Mississippi, the lifeblood river of the Confederacy, was now in Union hands. Their country was split between the East and the West. In the words of Abraham Lincoln, "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea." With the loss of Vicksburg, the Confederate states west of the Mississippi, including Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas, were cut off from the rest of the Confederacy, disrupting military communication, troop movements, and the flow of vital supplies. Again, the Union had just deprived the Confederacy of manpower, and it heavily boosted Union morale. Another massive consequence of the Vicksburg victory is that it put the Union's best general in command of the war. Grant's brilliant campaign at Vicksburg convinced President Lincoln to give him command. July 4th, 1863 will forever be the second most influential July 4th in American history. The date of dual victories, one in the West and one in the East, that took almost 60,000 Southern troops out of the war. It will forever be seen as the point in the war where the Confederacy had no prospects of victory, the Independence Day that won the Civil War.